So welcome everyone to another of our readings from Oconomowaukee. Today we are hosting Matt Haig all the way from Brighton. So that's quite a leap over the waters there. Matt is the author of 5 novels, including The Humans, which was one of our favorites at Books and Company, 2 works of nonfiction, and several children's books, including A Boy Called Christmas, which is being made into a Netflix movie to be released in 2021. And I think that's going to be in the US as well as the UK, is it not, Matt?
It is, yes. And it's actually, they were very lucky because it finished filming just before everything kicked off this year. So that's all in post-production now. So yes.
Oh, that's great. So it'll be a simultaneous release. It'll be a Christmas movie we can look forward to.
Yes, it's definitely going to be in America on Netflix. Yes, next year. Well, as far as we can predict anything in this world right now. If we're still here, you know, it's going to be that. Yeah.
So we'll be talking today about the Midnight Library. So do you want to start by telling us a little bit about Nora and how she comes to the Midnight Library?
Yes. Nora is the protagonist of the story. She is in a very bad, dark place at the start of this book. She feels like she's run out of options in life. She's just lost her job. Her pet has died. Her parents died a long time ago, but they still play a part in her mind in terms of her life choices, in terms of the sense of regret and sort of shame she has about her existence. She feels basically in a very boxed off kind of place in life, and it's a situation quite similar to one I was in when I was younger, so I put a lot of myself into that early part of the book. Then she takes drastic action, puts her life in her own hands. She ends up between life and death, and then she finds herself in the Midnight Library. And the Midnight Library is not a normal library, it's an infinite library. The shelves go on for eternity. Each book on the shelf is a different version of her life if she had lived it a different way. And simply to access those lives, all she needs to do is open the book up, start to read. Then she is literally transported into that life. Along the way, she has the help of a librarian called Mrs. Elm, who is someone she knows from her own life, but this is a slightly different version of someone from her past that she knows. And she's this kind of almost godlike figure who sort of steers her in different directions, and is therapist meet librarian type way. So Nora has to work out A, if life's worth living, and B, what is the best way for her to actually exist in this world, if there is such a life for her.
Did you, Daniel, I missed this part because I was out of the loop, but did you want to read a little bit before we start into the conversation?
Me, yes, I will read a little bit. I'll read something from quite early on. I'll read a little bit when she actually first gets to the Midnight Library itself. Okay, here we go. This is a chapter called The Moving Shelves. This is page 31 of the American edition. Okay. The shelves on either side of Nora began to move. They didn't change angles, they just kept on sliding horizontally. It was possible the shelves weren't moving at all, but the books were, and it wasn't obvious why or even how. There was no visible mechanism making it happen, and no sound or sight of books falling off the end, or rather the start of the shelf. The books slid by at varying degrees of slowness, depending on the shelf they were on, but none moved fast. What's happening? Mrs. Elm's expression stiffened, her posture straightened, her chin retreated a little into her neck. She took a step closer to Nora, clasped her hands together. It is time, my dear, to begin. If you don't mind me asking, begin what? Every life contains many millions of decisions, some big, some small. But every time one decision is taken over another, the outcomes differ. An irreversible variation occurs, which in turn leads to further variations. These books are portals to all the lives you could be living. What? You have as many lives as you have possibilities. There are lives where you make different choices, and those choices lead to different outcomes. if you had done just one thing differently, you would have a different life story. And they all exist in the Midnight Library. They are all as real as this life. Parallel lives, not always parallel. Some are more perpendicular. So do you want to live a life you could be living? Do you want to do something differently? Is there anything you wish to change? Did you do anything wrong? That was an easy one. Yes, she said, absolutely everything. There you go. That was a taste.
You have clearly entered the field of the multiverse novel, and it is a beloved subgenre that doesn't have enough books in it. What made you kind of choose to go there?
Are you being sarcastic with me, Daniel?
No, I really do. I mean, I have to say, I call them sliding doors novels after the.
You know what? I had an idea. I had an idea for a parallel life book about 10 years ago, and I thought, I'm not writing a parallel life, but there's so many parallel life novels in this multiverse, in this timeline we're in. We've got, well, in movies alone, you've got Sliding Doors, It's a Wonderful Life, and a bazillion other movies. We've had variations on the theme from like Life After Life, Kate Atkinson. I'm going a bit blank, but there's lots and lots of books. We know there's lots of books in the literary and fantasy genres that are parallel life. So I thought, even though it's a subject I've always been fascinated by, and a science that I'm genuinely interested in for someone who's not particularly scientifically minded, I thought, I'm not going to write this until I have a reason to write it or something new to add to the mix. And it wasn't until I got the actual concept of the library itself, because the library was for me like the perfect kind of metaphor, because in a way, a library is a portal to other worlds, you know, not to wax too much on about libraries, but I love libraries. I love bookshops. I love being surrounded by books. And if you think about what a book is access to another life. And I think one of the reasons we like reading fiction is because we get to live in other worlds for a little while. We get to inhabit other perspectives, other minds. So once I had the concept of the library, I thought, okay, I've got a novel, and it's something a little bit different, yet feels kind of like, you know, I kind of like, I mean, there's a lot of emphasis of always trying to do something new, but I kind of like that quite warm and comforting feeling of being a sort of storyteller and sort of gathering people around the campfire and telling a story which has a balance of familiar with new. And I had initially a lot of familiar, and then when I got the library, I had some new in the mix as well. And I thought, okay, we can have a story here, we can have fun. And I also liked it because it matched the sort of like philosophical aspect of the book with the plot aspect of the book. So the Midnight Library, I wasn't having to swing between sort of philosophy and storytelling. It was kind of the library itself was the theme of the book as well as the plot device of the book, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I wasn't kidding at all. I mean, I do like them. Our buyer reads all of them. I mean, I just like, but I was one of
there are a lot though. You are absolutely right. There are, it's not a genre you feel like, oh, we definitely need more parallel life stories. You know, there are a lot. I mean, there's always a reason to add to something if you feel like you have to, and you feel like you've got something different. But I was reluctant for years before I embarked on this book. I wrote so many different books, but this one kept on calling me because I'm obsessed with the science of it. There's a great book, actually, it's an American physicist, Brian Greene, who wrote a book called The Hidden Reality. And as I say, I'm not a science geek at all. I really did badly at science at school. I won't bore you with my exam results, but they were not good. I did not get good grades at science. But as a grown-up person, I find it as a trying to create things, I find it a source of inspiration, actual science. And anyway, this book, The Hidden Reality, it explores all the modern branches of science that we have, all the different competing schools of thought, and how they all lead to the probability that there is a multiverse. The nature of this multiverse changes, but the science from quantum theory, string theory, all the different branches of contemporary science, scientific thinking leads to the understanding that there is some kind of multiverse, whether that's a universe on top of a universe on top of a universe, as in the Midnight Library, or whether it's like universes, you know, at the edge of this universe, there is another universe after, I don't know, whether it's all a computer simulation, who knows, but all the thinking leads towards this possibility. And I find that like a sort of simultaneously depressing, but also massively hopeful concept all at once. There's something kind of bittersweet about it that's enticing.
I'm passing to Lisa, but I just want to mention, it's my theory that everybody should write a multiverse novel, just sort of like you get to write one Jane Austen's play, you know, you get to write one book that reads backwards, you know, like there's all these sort of things that everybody should have a go at. So
yeah, it's just like a pop band needs to write a breakup song. A novelist needs to do their parallel life, you know, story. You've got to do it. It's a rite of passage. Absolutely, Daniel.
And we need them too, because as you've done in this novel, you've used it as a way to explore how we view ourselves and how we view our regrets. And and you talk about how, you know, in your books, and especially in Reasons to Stay Alive, you talk a lot about mental health and about finding reasons to live. And you're using this to sort of explore those options and how we tell our stories. So do you want to talk a little bit about how you wove those two together? And you said it was a little autobiographical.
Yeah, no, definitely. And for those that don't know, I've written some non-fiction books as well. And one of them, the one that was biggest in my country in the UK, actually it was my biggest book in total out of everything I've written in the UK, was a book called Reasons to Stay Alive. And that was a very personal account of my experience in my 20s of having a full-blown breakdown. I was diagnosed with panic disorder, suicidal depression, OCD for a little while. I had a smorgasbord of horrible mental health conditions, and it felt like a full-blown breakdown in my 20s. I was suicidal for a long time. And yes, it was like the darkest experience of my life. I definitely wouldn't want to relive that experience, but it changed me as a person in not totally horrendous ways, just as this very strange year we're having now, which, you know, collectively is not a good experience. It can have sort of positive outcomes or things that we're sort of valuing more than we did before and stuff like that. Same too with my own sort of personal history, having that sort of catastrophic mental experience, and turned me in a very strange way from a pessimistic person to an optimistic person. And I can't fully explain it, but I think it has something to do with the fact that depression for years gave me a very convincing, very pessimistic, bleak outlook on life. It made me totally pessimistic, and I thought optimism was a lie. But what I realized by holding on and staying alive was that actually the things depression had been telling me, they were all false. That was the fake news. Depression was the fake news, because depression had told me, for instance, I would be dead by the age of 25. Depression told me that my partner would leave me. Depression told me this, that, and the other. And obviously lots of bad things have happened to me in my life, like any other life. But that total blanket catastrophic worldview that depression gave, that was the fake news. That was the thing that was wrong. And that was the thing that was a lie. So when I recovered, my experience of recovery was almost like a stubborn rebellion of optimism. I was suddenly determined to hold on to optimism, because yes, optimism can be fake, but optimism, unlike pessimism, can be useful. And optimism is a kind of weapon against depression. And I think we need, you know, and we're in quite despairing times now, obviously, and I feel like it's in those times you need hope the most. Hope is kind of like a luxury in the good times, but it's a necessity in the bad times. And this is slightly a side point off from your question, I know, but I've been reading various things this year. I've been reading a lot of Buddhism, actually, and there's a great book called When Things Fall Apart by Pema Chodron, I think, and she's an American Tibetan Buddhist. Anyway, I'm not a Buddhist, but I do like reading about Buddhism because it's great about uncertainty. Because in the West, we're so conditioned to see uncertainty as a bad thing. We want to be in control of our lives. We want to be in control of everything. And uncertainty is seen as a source of anxiety. Whereas a sort of more Eastern-minded approach would be to see uncertainty as actually the source of hope. Uncertainty as the source, you might have a bad thing coming up in the calendar that you absolutely know about, but there's still uncertainty there about how you will cope with it, whether something good will come out of it, whether it won't be quite as bad as you feel. So uncertainty can be a positive thing as well. But yes, I put a lot of that sort of mental health talk and experience and thinking into the character of Nora, and it's the first time I've done that in fiction. And actually, I felt freer writing about mental health in fiction, especially as it was a female character, someone who was clearly not me. In a weird way, that was a kind of shield, so I could actually put more sort of truth and autobiography in there, because I knew that readers wouldn't mistake me for Nora, so yeah, it felt great and it felt comforting. And one weird thing, one question I get asked a lot is, because I write a lot about depression, is people say, is it hard or is it painful, going back to the worst times of your life, going back to those depressing places? And it never, ever feels like that. It always feels like a liberation, really, like a release. Because if you've been through anything traumatic in your life, it's always there at some level. So the moment of writing about it, you're externalizing something very internal that's always been there. And the moment you externalize it, it's almost like taking out a kidney stone or something. That's a mental version of that, because it's taking out pain and giving it light. And then it becomes somehow, it doesn't magically go away, but it somehow becomes this shared thing, this manageable thing, this thing that's given language and therefore understanding. And, I think that's what therapy is anyway, isn't it? So yeah, this novel was kind of self-therapy for me, first and foremost, and hopefully, other people get the same things from it.
It's funny that you feel like, first of all, I just want to, I don't know where to go. I want to say, but you're supposed to tell I did know that you actually did write this a little bit, at least, with a male protagonist.
Yes, this is true. The first draft I did. This is right. Yes, you've done your research. This is good. This is the rare thing.
All away.
Versus, yes, the first draft of the Midnight Library, at least the first half of the Midnight Library. And I'm saying this, and I'm aware my editor, my American editor, Patrick Nolan, is somewhere watching with us today. But anyway, the first draft was written from a male perspective, and I knew it wasn't right. And the reason I knew it wasn't right is because I kept on changing the name of the character. If you're ever writing a story and you've got a main character and you keep on changing this character's name, it was Adam, then it was Harvey, then it kept on changing. And that is a warning sign. That is a red flag right there, that you are not seeing this character. This character doesn't, and the problem isn't the name. You keep changing the name, waiting for the magic name, and it's not going to be solved by getting the right name. And the reason the character wasn't right when it was male was because I think it was like too much me. It was too much myself. I couldn't see the character because, if you've ever been slightly vain and you've stared at yourself slightly too long in the mirror and you can't see what you look like anymore because it's your face and you don't know, it's hard to see yourself like others see you. So it was with this character. I couldn't see who this character was because it felt too close to me. So by changing the gender, even though as a male writer, but you have to be extremely sensitive and get a lot of female eyes on it before you show it to the world. And there were all kinds of horrendous things I did wrong in that first draft as a typical male writer. And luckily I've got the most brutal first reader in my wife who has no hesitation in saying when I'm being cringy or horrendous. Yes, but as soon as it wasn't me, I felt in a weird way, I felt more confident writing the character as a female, because it was suddenly a character rather than myself, if that makes sense.
Lisa, go.
Oh.
Yeah. Try again.
I'm there, I'm here. Well, and so thinking about that and how you sort of following in on my question before too, is that it was for me a very comforting book to read during COVID. And I know you didn't write it during COVID and you didn't anticipate this, but it's been a time in which we've been all sort of very self-reflective. And last month I was listening to the English poet David White talk about one of his poems, Start Close In. And in the conversation about the poem, he said that, you know, in our educational life, we never really get rewarded for not knowing. We're almost always forced to manufacture an answer that someone else wanted. And I kept thinking about that while you were talking about the lives and the regrets that we have, and the not knowing. And maybe during this uncertain time, being able to reflect on that was very helpful. And I don't know if you had thought much about that perspective when you were writing about her regrets and where they come from.
Yeah, I mean, for me, regrets, I mean, I try not to have regrets now. I've got a very sort of accepting approach to life, but certainly when I was younger, the nature of my mental health problems was characterized by regrets. You know, when I was suicidal, it was always like, how did I end up here? I was always fantasizing about if I'd have done something differently, or if I'd have been healthier, or if I'd have done this or that. And, you know, it taught you tormented by all these sort of parallel possibilities. And I think this year, obviously I didn't write it this year. I did edit it though. I edited it in February, March time. And I knew, you know, the COVID news was really there in the air when I was editing it, but I didn't want to deliberately reference COVID, because I wrote the book, I created the book in 2019. The situation was so fast changing. I thought anything I write now is going to be instantly dated, and it just looked a little bit tacked on. So I kept the novel true to how I wrote it, but I was mindful when I was editing it about this new kind of new reality we're in. And yes, it's been a stressful year, but it's also been a very contemplative year. I think we've all had a lot of time away from friends and socializing a lot of the time, and going to the pub as we do in our country. You know, the pubs were closed in England. You know, that, you know, doesn't get much bigger than the pubs being closed in England. So yeah, and there's a lot of time of just thinking and imagining how things can be and reassessing what matters to us. Like, yes, there's been a lot of things we've missed this year, but also there's been a lot of things that we haven't missed. You know, a lot of things, certainly, like, you know, for instance, for me, long commutes into London for pointless meetings. I'm actually quite grateful to be able to do a meeting in my bare feet in my kitchen with my kids around me. You know, that feels a little bit better. I mean, most things haven't been better, but there've been one or two. This is better. You know, I don't know if I would have been able to come to Milwaukee and be there, but I can be there. So launching a book has been very interesting this year. It's been very different experience. It's enabled me to talk to more people. It's been annoying that I haven't been able to like chat to readers properly like you would do in a normal event. This is nice because I kind of see a few faces and stuff, so it sort of replicates the book experience. But yeah, no, it's strange. Sorry, that answer was all over the place. But you know,
question. But you didn't know these things though before you were writing it, so you had that sense of self-reflection prior to.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think I've always been someone who thinks about life probably a bit too much. I think that comes back from the old sort of like breakdown years and all of that, because any kind of mental health condition makes you a philosopher. It might not make you a good philosopher, but you're asking those philosophical questions about why am I here? What's the purpose of life? All of that stuff. And this has been a very philosophical year, I think. Everyone is like, well, you know, where do we want to go as a society? What matters? How much should we be caring about other people? All those big philosophical questions. And yeah, I mean, I definitely don't think you need an experience of mental illness to be a writer. But if you've gone through any pain in your life, you can use that pain, and it can help that pain by exploring it. And the feelings of regret and that continual questioning is definitely something that I've always been trying to solve. And the Midnight Library was kind of that. I mean, the Midnight Library itself is almost like a therapy room where she goes, and Mrs. Elm, the librarian, is the therapist, and she's having these therapy sessions in between, trying out different versions. So it's like, as well as a metaphor for libraries, it's almost a metaphor for therapy, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, obviously, I think anybody who's a reader loves this library. I have to say, when you described the books moving, it reminded me of those dry cleaner machines. I don't know if you have them. I was like, it's sort of that, and it's sort of like also if you ever go to one of those sushi restaurants where the dishes go around the conveyor
we have a
belt.
lot of this. Yeah.
We don't, so I have to drive really far for them, but every once in a while, I think of them fondly. But I was like, one of the things I loved is like you slip in all these little things, like, so for Nora, it's a library. We have a little hint. I'm just going to have a hint of people playing off the last book where she meets somebody else at one point. I'm not really giving anything away. She meets somebody else who's also in this experience, and he's in a video store. And then you drop a few hints, and I wanted to like I think there was an art museum and maybe a restaurant. So how did you visualize? So do I go in the paintings? Do I eat the food to give birth to life? Did you have another one that you didn't do? Which one would yours be? What do you think it would be?
Well, I think I'd like mine to be a library. I think a library is one I wanted to. I mean, a video store would be another possibility for me, because I did spend a lot of my teenage years in a video store. I grew up in a very small town, which you probably haven't heard of, a place called Newark-on-Trent in Nottinghamshire, in the centre of England. We were the original Newark before New Jersey ever had a Newark. We were Newark, so we were there first. But yes, we had nothing going on in a small town. I always get in trouble in England for disrespecting my hometown, but as I don't think anyone here is from Newark-on-Trent, I will tell you the truth. It culturally had nothing. Like, it didn't have a bookstore, it didn't have a cinema. So being a teenager who's into kind of artsy cultural stuff and movies and music, it was the kind of archetypal place you wanted to sort of get out of a little bit. I like it now as a grown-up person, but as a teenager, it was very frustrating. But there was a video store and there was a library, and those two places were my portal to other worlds of, I don't know, Stephen King novels or Jean-Claude Van Damme films or whatever it was that I was giving my teenage brain. Yeah, so it would be one of those two. But yeah, an art gallery would be interesting, how the mechanics of that would work. Whether it be like, you know, like a Matisse painting where you've got a painting inside a painting inside a painting. I don't know.
Did you have a Mrs. Elm in your life?
I had two Mrs. Elms. I think Mrs. Elm is a combination of people, but neither of them was a librarian. I'm nothing against librarians. There wasn't a particular standout librarian in my youth, even though I had a great library. Mrs. Elm is a combination of a English teacher, my literature teacher at secondary school, which was senior school. No, probably middle school. What are you, when you're 11, you're at middle school, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so when I was about 11, 12, 13, I had this teacher who was great, called Mrs. Kurzweil, and I showed her some of my creative writing. And back then it was mainly Star Wars fan fiction, I have to be honest. But for some reason she saw some potential in it and she told me to keep writing. She was also the person, unusually for a teacher at that age, she was the person who first taught me about books being another entertainment form, because up until that point I'd read a lot of books, but I always thought books were the things you read to do you good, like almost like eating like whole grain cereal or something. Books existed to make you a better person. I didn't know that they could be as thrilling or as dangerous or as exciting as video games and cinema all the rest of it. So she had quite, not a disrespect for books, but they weren't these lofty, abstract things, which I'd been encouraged to believe they were, that were, you know, like you read John Steinbeck because it was there to do you good and nurture your soul. But you can also read books that are just sort of thrilling and entertaining and could be your friend. So yeah, she was great. And also my grandmother, my late long lost grandmother, who was my mother's mum, but she was not my blood grandmother because my mother was adopted and my mother never knew her actual family, but she was the most loving, kind person, but she had a kind of tough love edge. She told it like it was. She didn't suffer fools gladly. She was kind of a strict person in some ways, but she was a great person. She had 2 adopted children, and before that, in the Second World War, she'd lived in the countryside in Devon, in the southwest of England, and on a farm, and she had lots of evacuee children from the East End of London who had gone to escape the bombing and to look after these very poor, impoverished children who had separated from her family. So she was a lovely, inspirational person. So she's the other Mrs. Elm. Yes.
I just want to say she was like a character in that Chris Cleave novel. So
yes, well, I haven't read that Chris Cleave novel. I have read a Chris Cleave novel, but no,
the World War II one, yeah. So
yeah, but no, it was like something out of a movie. I sometimes think about writing her story because yeah, she was great, but not great in a real sort of saintly do-gooder way. She was great in a kind of very earthy kind of get things done kind of way. Yeah.
And she had a good approach to chess.
Yes, well, yes, and chess, actually, chess is in the book. There's a lot of chess in the Midnight Library because I was playing a lot of chess as I was writing it because I was teaching my son Lucas how to play chess and to try and get him a bit less screen time and play something real world. So we were doing a lot of chess, and he was beating me. Even though he's 11 years old, he was absolutely beating me. He was getting checkmate in about 9 moves. But that's not an exaggeration. I'm not the world's best chess player, but I did like it as a metaphor. Chess is so good for metaphors. There's just so many metaphors. Like, you know, just the humble pawn itself, how that becomes a queen by just steadfastly moving one space after another. Because there's so many life lessons in chess. So I like it from that. Maybe because I was too busy thinking of metaphors rather than concentrating on the game is why I kept on
writing your next book.
Yeah, exactly.
I never learned it because I was trying to teach my kids and I was so worried about what they were doing. I wasn't playing, and they got better so quickly that it was pointless. Oh,
okay. No, I do like chess. And also I was writing another novel at the time as well about set in the Ukraine, about a 11-year-old chess champion whose father was a gangster, and it just was the worst thing I've ever written in my life. But the only good thing about it was all the paragraphs about chess. So I stole some of those paragraphs and transplanted them into the Midnight Library. Yeah.
Well, of all the lives that you wrote in the for Nora, was there one that was a favorite, and how did you whittle them all down? Did I take Daniel?
Yeah,
I like the question.
Okay.
It's a good question. I think it's hard. I mean, I think the one that was most wish fulfillment for me was the music career one, because I'd given up piano at the age of 13 because I was a self-conscious teenage boy, and going to Mrs. Peters' piano lessons on a Friday evening was not the coolest thing to be doing. So I always regret giving up piano. I wonder about the other life where I'm like, you know, Elton John or something. But no, I think that in terms of the fun one to write, that was the one set in the Arctic Circle where she's a glaciologist, because it was fun to research stuff, because I know nothing about glaciers. I know nothing about, well, I do know something about Norway, but not that part of Norway. I've got some Norwegian family, but I don't know about the north of Norway. And so that was fun just from the research perspective. The most challenging and also interesting to write was one of the the later ones, where it's not such a sort of far-fetched fantastical life. It's a sort of family life that she has, because I knew there would be some lives which were like wishes that she shouldn't have wished for, that were fantastical dreams, that were really nightmares. But I thought it would be more interesting to have some lives that were actually quite good, and then being nothing overtly wrong with them. And, you know, there's a life where she's a wife and mother, and she's studying a subject that she's really interested in, and nothing's overtly wrong with it, but she has to come to her own conclusions. And that was the most sort of challenging one to write. So I'd probably say that one.
Yeah, and that was the one where it felt like she was gonna, you know, it felt close.
Yeah,
it felt very close.
One of the things I really love about your work is that the way there is this, I haven't read all the kids' books, but the way that the adult books sort of have this through line through it. And you're like, I'm writing a multiverse book, but in a way, it so ties into the other books, because, you know, your last book, the person's living for 1,000 years. You've got an alien who impersonates a human, is also immortal. So in a way, and then even the Radleys, they're vampires, so they're dealing with time. They all, if you had told me that you were a devout Buddhist, I would have said, of course you are. Because so many of the stories about living in the moment, and even The Midnight Library is a book about potential immortality, because she could be riding these lives for as long as she wanted to. And
yeah.
they're set up, instead of vertically or whatever, lengthwise, the way, say, the last book was, they're sort of horizontal next to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you make that decision to like have this sort of philosophy? Do you know this philosophy from any of their books, or does it just keep on catching you? Do you know what I mean?
No, I genuinely don't. I don't have it's not a conscious thing. You know, you as a writer, one of the best things, maybe the best thing about being a writer, or I suppose any creative person doing it in any creative industry, is you kind of find out who you are by what you choose to put out in the world. You know, so you find out your interests, and you find out what sort of person you are. And it's kind of, I suppose writing in that sense is a kind of way of seeing yourself. I suppose reading does the same thing, you know, by your own tastes in what you want to read and what you want to have reflected back at you. So yeah, it's accidental, Daniel. I just sort of write what I'm interested in. I often, to be honest, I often try and sit down and write. You know, I'm always called like a speculative fantasy writer, but that is totally accidental. I don't always read in that genre. I often sit down to write a totally realistic book that's set in a very knowable domestic setting. There's no afterlife, there's no immortality, there's no vampire walking in. But then by chapter 3, I run out of reality, and I get bored, and I just feel like, you know, if you're using your imagination, I feel it's almost a bit of a waste to just not properly use your imagination and just go off in a tangent. And I actually feel, and it's not about escaping reality as such, I genuinely feel that when you're reading something that's clearly not real in one sense, you can actually learn, it has to have some truth to it. Like, even if you're writing a zombie apocalypse novel, actually a zombie apocalypse novel would feel like documentary, wouldn't it, right now? But yeah, but whatever you're writing about, if you're writing your big mermaids and unicorns fantasy epic, it still has to feel true. You don't have to necessarily get your readers to believe in mermaids and unicorns, but it has to be emotionally true. It has to be true to the world you're creating. So, you know, I find slipping out into something like The Midnight Library, or into the idea of slow aging humans who can live to 800, or whatever it is, I use those as ways to explore things that I'm bothered about in real life. So The Midnight Library, regret is a very real thing, and The Midnight Library was a device to explore that, and how to explore acceptance, and how to evolve from wishing you were someone else, or wishing you had a better life, or whatever it is. And in my novel, How to Stop Time, that was very much, I suppose that was my midlife crisis novel. That was, how do I accept growing older? How do I accept, you know, grief? How do I deal with looking after elderly relatives? You know, this, that, and the other. So whatever you're worried about, or whatever you're thinking about, it comes out in your fiction, even if you're writing quite fantastical, non-realistic stuff.
Lisa?
That-
Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Don't
Up.
repeat yourself. Sorry, that was my fault.
So if the last one was your midlife crisis, does that make the humans maybe when your kids were toddlers?
Yeah, the humans.
Then you know, loving beings after that, like he comes down and he's like, oh, but then that pull.
Yes. Interesting. The Humans, although not many people in America read The Humans. The Humans, I think, was the book.
They did at my store.
Oh, good. Oh, thank you. The Humans was the book I wrote that, that's the book where I found myself as a writer, because up until that point, my books were very bleak. I'm sort of seen as quite an optimistic writer now, but my books up until that point, I wrote a book once called The Possession of Mr. Cave, which even in the UK, not many people read. And with good reason, because it was just very depressing. I mean, everybody died in that book. Like everyone, it was like, I can't even look, it's not, I think it's one of my better ones in terms of the writing, but I can't look at it now because I was depressed when I was writing it. And it's like looking at a photo from your past, which is just so dark. And then after that, I had a turnaround, and The Humans was the first time I embraced optimism. And that might have been from having kids. I'd become a father, which also meant I was a lot tireder. But I feel like I had this moment in my 30s where I thought, if I'm putting stuff out into the world, if I'm, you know, if you're self-indulgent enough to feel like the world needs your stories, or anyone wants to read your stories, why not try and put something that's got some kind of authentic use or positivity to it, even if it's fiction, something that's actually makes people feel a bit better? Because up until that point, I thought the job of the writer or artist or creative was to reflect the bleakness or violence or horror of the world. And I just got bored of doing that. I thought, you know, it wasn't making me feel good as a writer, and therefore it probably wasn't making people feel great reading it either. So yeah, The Humans was my turnaround. It literally was a midpoint in the novel, if you read the book The Humans, where I go from being a pessimistic, sort of cynical writer to being a sort of optimistic, slightly more whimsical, sentimental writer. And it sort of happens within the space of that book. I can't remember what your question was, but that was my thing on The Humans.
But I think too, you're writing the hopefulness, or the speculative part is very much metaphor and sort of the tales, like fables. And so they, you know, they do have that imagination. They're not just straight.
Yeah, well, The Humans, because The Humans, that book, well, that was about an alien who takes on human form. And so everyone thinks he's this professor of mathematics at Cambridge University, and really he is an alien from another galaxy, from a planet called Baudoin. But that was me writing about recovery from mental illness, because that was how I felt when I was mentally ill. I felt like an alien who didn't belong, yet looked like this quite average, young, healthy man when I was having my breakdown, and yet felt like a total alien all of a sudden, totally felt human beings were weird creatures. And I felt like from another planet during that time. And so The Humans was science fiction, but it was also the most realistic way I could write about that feeling. And so I'm so pleased we're now in an age where science fiction and fantasy and stuff like that are actually getting the respect they deserve, because these things aren't little, you know, I'm not talking about my books, I'm talking about the genre, but they're not like little escapes that people have because they can't cope with reality. They're often a way of deeply exploring human concerns and things that we all think and feel about.
Yeah, I always thought science fiction readers were much smarter than people gave them credit for.
I think it's true. I still haven't finished June. I mean, June, you know, everything is in June, and it's as deep and as rich as Tolstoy, and it always beats me every time. But yeah, I mean, there's everything in there, and writers, you know, a lot of literary writers like Margaret Atwood or whoever have given respectability to it. But you know, whatever, even the pure sort of fantasy fiction stuff has got stuff that's really worth thinking about. Yeah, sorry.
We have a few questions. Aaron Cole is on the call, who would like to know, well, first of all, he gives you a lovely compliment. You do a phenomenal job of taking meaningful concepts and presenting them in ways that don't feel forced or preachy. We'd like you to know what your advice is to young authors who want to present meaningful themes in books. He's particularly interested in kids' books, but generally too.
Okay. Well, I've written kids' books, and actually, I have learned more from writing kids' books about writing than I have from writing adult books. When I write books for grown-ups, I actually try and keep that feeling of what I have in my head when I'm writing a children's book, because I know it sounds corny, but I genuinely believe children are better readers than grown-ups in one sense. Okay, their vocabularies may be smaller. There might be certain themes that you have to stay away from, but imaginatively, in terms of the imagination, you can throw anything at a child reader and they will go with it. They won't necessarily believe it as real. They won't necessarily believe that trolls or unicorns or pixies are real, but they will go with the daydream in a way that adults can be a little bit suspicious about, and kids will take it on its own terms. So first bit of advice would be, you know, whether you're writing for children or for adults, to always speak to the actual child within the adult or the child within the child, and actually, you know, not be afraid of imagination and going, you know, one of the joys of fiction is a way to explore that other reality we have. We have the real world reality, and then we have the imagination. And so it would be to embrace that side and to sort of like, you know, I think also, I've had a few arguments with editors over the years, not but one currently watching this, I hasten to add, my children's editor, about all the themes that can be included within a children's book, because I think children can take a lot more than we give them credit for. I'm not talking sex and violence stuff. I'm talking you know, about grief and you know, children, like adults, they have painful things that happen in their lives. They can experience loss. They can experience dramatic, intense emotions if they have to move house or go to school, start school or change school or whatever. And I think children's fiction needs to explore that same intensity of emotion occasionally as grown-up fiction. And yes, there are ways to do it. And I managed to do it in a book about Santa Claus as a boy, but it's still a book, even though it's a sort of comedy in some sense, it's also a book about loss and about change. And so, yeah, I think whatever your subject matter is, I think if you've got if you're actually tackling something that is genuinely, sincerely emotional, even if it's the most outrageous fantasy, that's how you connect to the reader. And that applies to children too. They don't just want toilet humor all the time, non-stop. They actually want something that can be a friend to them and give them comfort just as much as grown-up people do.
Lisa, do you mind if I ask a few more of the questions? First of all, I want to give a shout out to Patrick, your editor. So
he's a very good editor, and he's done a brilliant job. I mean, the cover of the Midnight Library, I had nothing to do with the cover, so I'm genuinely boost up the cover, but they've made it a really classy looking book. I can't comment on the words inside, but it looks great. I have to self-deprecate, even if I don't mean it. It's just like,
it's part of your essence. I get it.
Yeah. Being a British person. Right.
From Ilka, the Buddhist librarian, and I actually know this answer because you told me. Have you read When Things Fall Apart or other books regarding Buddhism before you wrote The Midnight Library? There are a number of Buddhist concepts in the narrative. Signed, a librarian who practices Buddhism.
Ah, yes. When I hadn't, I'd known of When Things Fall Apart before. I'd known Pima Chodron. I'd read, I'd done that thing where you go on Goodreads and you read all their quotes. I'd done that. I hadn't read it until this year, but I had, I've always been a bit interested in the Buddhism and Taoism and those Eastern concepts, just from a philosophical sense. Yeah, so I definitely, they were always kind of in my mind, and that idea of acceptance and about how joy and suffering aren't necessarily opposites, but they're kind of intrinsically related. And that's something that I know from my own life, how the sort of worst experiences of my life sort of led in very indirect ways to some of the better experiences of my life and to feelings of gratitude and stuff. And very often the opposite is true. Something we think is going to be the most amazing experience in our life isn't necessarily. So I'm very interested in, and that's a kind of a Buddhist thing about how pain and joy are interwoven. And that is definitely something, not just the Midnight Library, but something that I've written about in other books too.
I'm going to waive my next question and go to Lisa because my heater went on and it's a little noisy. So
I don't have another question. You've got all the questions.
We could.
I meant from you.
Oh, from me. Oh. Well, and that's interesting. You're talking about Buddhism too, because I felt that in this book. And that, you know, when Daniel and I were talking earlier, is so many plots depend on direct conflict. And yours just was finding that balance between the joy and the conflict. Instead of making the conflict drive it, it was almost finding the balance. And do you feel that? Because,
yeah,
you know what I mean? It was sort of a parallel journey, hand in hand.
Yes, definitely. And in many ways, it sort of breaks a lot of the sort of rules that you kind of, people are taught in creative writing courses. In many ways, like for instance, there's quite a lot of exposition in this novel. In some ways, I think it's relatively predictable because it's not trying to be a twisty book in that sense. It's not trying to have a surprise ending that pulls the rug out from under your feet. I suppose it's kind of like, yeah, holding hands in a therapy session, sort of taking the reader with you and trying to be a comfort, or at least explore things or give some sort of resonance to someone else's experiences. So yeah, it's very different even to my own other novels in that sense, that there is a plot, kind of a character arc and that stuff, but it's not your conventional plot where there's so many inciting incidents and this happens and that happens and a character betrays her or this, that and the other. It is more backseat, contemplative, kind of calmer, I suppose, by my standards. Yeah, it's kind of chilled out plot-wise. That's one way. Even though a lot of things happen, they happen in different lives. And so as soon as she goes back to the library, it's kind of reset. The challenge was to not make it too much like a short story collection, because although I enjoy short story collections, I didn't want it to have that kind of episodic feel where it's just like an anthology and we're not getting any kind of growth. But I wanted the growth not to be necessarily in plot terms, but in terms of her sort of emotional arc. So yeah, it's not conventional in that sense, but yeah, I like that. It's kind of like, I don't know, it felt like almost like reciting a mantra or a meditation. You don't, like in a meditation, you don't want a plot twist.
Right.
That wouldn't be the thing to have.
Plot twist.
Yeah, you don't want the scary clown to come out of the cupboard halfway through.
But it didn't feel like it was, you were preaching though. That's what was nice. I mean, and I liked how from one experience to the other, she kind of had residual memories, residual experience to carry forward. So it wasn't like she was just leaving time and starting new.
No, and also the other characters, you know, so we're familiar with a lot of the characters in each life. So we see a different facet to her brother Joe, for instance, who's kind of damaged in some lives, but he's got it together in other lives. And yeah, her parents feature, and then they don't feature, and then you've got Mrs. Elm running through it as well. So yes, you're getting to know characters, even though the settings are completely different, and even though it's almost like amnesia where she's waking up each day. It's almost like before I go to sleep, but you know, in a different different life.
Yep. Yeah, it was good. It worked very well.
Thank
It's
you.
a great crossover novel for teens.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, perfect for teens too.
Yeah, well, this is what happens when you. Yeah, this is what happens when you're like trying to write for the sort of child in the adult. I think like you sort of you find that like in a storyteller, and like, you know, I always, when you're writing a book, it's almost helpful to forget that you're writing a book and almost to imagine that metaphorical campfire, and you're just trying to keep everyone around the campfire, and you're not speaking to just one person at the campfire. You're primarily speaking to yourself, but hopefully in doing that you're speaking to other people too.
When we were talking about kids and adult, you just mentioned that, and Kathy Manning asked if you know an idea is definitively an adult idea or a kid's idea when you start.
It depends. With this, I did. When I was writing, for instance, A Boy Called Christmas, which is about Father Christmas, Santa Claus as a boy, I knew that was a children's story. But having said that, the actual feel of writing a children's book, to me, doesn't feel different to the actual feel of writing an adult book. You're not thinking, oh, I'm writing an adult book so I can use longer words. You're thinking, I'm writing this book about the Midnight Library, and what's the best way to tell this story? And there's some stories, you know, as you're writing, they will be marketed as a children's book or an adult book. But essentially, I'm trying to enjoy myself when I'm writing. So I'm always kind of writing for myself, whether it's writing a children's book that I would also like to read, or at least like to read to my children, or whether it's whether it's about vampires or aliens. I always write for myself first and foremost. So yes, I do generally know that it's an adult book or a children's book, but each book feels different to itself. So it doesn't feel different because it's an adult book, or it doesn't feel different because it's a children's book. I think another good writing tip that I always try and do is to imagine each book is a debut novel. So the more you write, the harder it is to conjure that. But if you write as if you've never written anything before, it can be fresher, and you feel freer to go wherever you want to go without expectation. But that can be an adult book or a children's book.
I have one last question I'm going to pass to Lisa, but it's a two-parter, because when you were talking about kids' books, I wanted to know, did you read the Alison McKay, A Time of Green Magic? I think it came. It's a British book. It came out here in the summer. It just reminded me, when you said the kind of books you like.
It's not a children's book.
It is a children's book. Okay. It's Hilary McKay, not Alison McKay, Hilary McKay, Time of Green Magic. It just had this, when you were talking, it is about a family that moves. It's a blended family, and she sort of feels like she's having problems, and she sort of feels like she's going into the book, sort of like she gets wet when she reads Kon-Tiki, and her brother's fighting with his best friend, and her other brother finds this imaginary cat that seems to be becoming more real. It just seems like something I think you'd like.
That's my sort of thing. I like those sort of things where you disappear into the world. Can you remember that film Pleasantville? Did you ever see Pleasantville?
Oh yeah.
Where they disappear into the TV show, and I love all that stuff. Yeah.
So on the vein of that, so my last question was going to be not a book that you really love, but necessarily, and I expect you to love it, but I don't want you to say, I like Moby Dick. Who doesn't? But a book that
I can see some faces.
That was a joke. But a book that you would recommend that people who like your books would like discover for folks who are reading all your books, but maybe not reading that many other books, is there a book or two that you would recommend to them and say, you need to discover this person or this book?
Well, I'm always bad at knowing what writers are like me. I will wait 1 second. I'm just going to.
Sure. We'll have a musical interlude with your guitars. Okay.
Just because it was right here. Sorry. Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke, which is a great book by a German poet, which looks really super highbrow and intimidating, but actually you can read it in an afternoon because it's like 70 pages long. And these were literally letters written by this poet to a younger poet, offering initially superficially advice about writing, but it turns into life advice about relationships, advice about the meaning of life, happiness, everything. But they are literal letters that he wrote at the start of the 20th century. And this for me is like a kind of sort of self-help book that I read a lot. It's not fiction either, but also I always mention the Winnie the Pooh books as well, because they are children's classics, obviously, but they're undervalued as life guides for grown-ups too, because I think everything is in Winnie the Pooh and the House at Pooh Corner, those books, because they are self-help books. They're one of the first proper self-help books. And if you think about Winnie the Pooh, every single character in Winnie the Pooh has a different mental complaint, a different symptom. For instance, you've obviously got Eeyore with depression. You've got Piglet with anxiety. You've got hyperactive Tigger. You've got Christopher Robin who's hallucinating everything, and you've got the whole mental spectrum there. And they're all sort of friends supporting each other. And this is actually serious. When I was super ill, I went back to my parents' house in Nottinghamshire, and the only books I had access to, because I was in Newark-on-Trent, where, as I say, there was no bookshops, the only books I had access to were my books I'd read as a child. And I read, in the midst of depression and panic disorder, I reread the Winnie the Pooh books, and they were the only books I could read at that time that sort of took me out of my mind. So you've got a bit of sort of heavy German poetic wisdom, and also A.A. Milne was my sort of, and I think I'm somewhere in the middle.
Lisa, you should ask the last question.
My last question will not be about books, because for me, books and music are inseparable. What are you listening to right now? And since you have guitars behind you, we're going to assume you love music too. Yes,
but don't assume I can play the guitar, because okay. I'm just trying to look like a flash rock star here. I can't play the guitar, but one of those guitars is mine, because I was going to learn the guitar with my son, but the others are my children's guitars. But there's also a piano, and I've actually been playing piano, replaying. I've been accessing the other life where I'm a musician during lockdown. So I'm one of those annoying people who've actually been trying to do something productive. So along with my son and daughter, I've been learning the piano. There's a great app. I'm not sponsored by them, but it's called Simply Piano, which is a great app where you can actually feel better than you are when you're playing the piano. So I can, for instance, play Bohemian Rhapsody now. It takes me 3 days, but I will be there. We'll get there. And so I've been listening to myself play Bohemian Rhapsody really slowly. That's what I've been listening to.
Perfect. Well, this has been delightful.
Yes, I've really enjoyed it. It's been very nice. I only wish we've got to do this in Milwaukee in a future happier time. But this has been a very happy time anyway. I've really liked talking to you. And
happy moments in whatever time, right?
Exactly.
So I wanted to remind everybody, the Midnight Library is available from either Books and Company or Boswell, and we are so grateful for Matt Haig. We're looking forward to your Christmas movie. Lisa and I are going to read all your kids' books aloud to each other, I guess. And
that would be fun.
And thank Thank you to, I noticed you did pick a Penguin Classic, so good for you. And
Yeah.
and thanks everybody for coming. Thank you to Books and Company, and thank you, Matt Haig. Lisa, take it away.
Daniel, thank you, Matt, for coming and for being here. It's been a delight, as always. I'll call you tonight, Daniel, and I'll read you a story.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.